So after the 5090 and 5080, the very high-end cards of the new GeForce generation, we now arrive at the slightly more reasonable priced cards with the RTX 5070 Ti, the one that personally seemed the most interesting to me on paper. Does this hold true in practice? Let's see, here we go. So the launch of the new RTX 5000 series has clearly been a painful process. So far on several levels, with a 5090 that certainly brought a decent generational gain of 25–30%, but nothing incredible since the price increased roughly in the same way, as did its power consumption, which inevitably reserves the card for a wealthy or professional, even semi-professional audience. Followed by an RTX 5080 that brought one of the smallest generational gaps in the 80 series with a mere 15%. As a result, it gave it more of a 4080 super vibe, which was not particularly exciting, especially since for these first two cards, the available stock at launch was quite scarce, particularly for the 5090, with demand far exceeding supply. This led to several of the issues we observed during the cryptocurrency mining boom, with a significant rise in retail prices, with everyone looking to make a quick buck along the way, whether in manufacturing, distribution, or sales. The situation was further exacerbated by the fact that Nvidia had been clearing out stocks of previous generation high-end cards for several months. As a result, there are still many buyers waiting for graphics cards to complete their setups. This ultimately also drives customers towards forced or impulsive purchases, opting for cards that are much more expensive than they should be, where RTX 4080s cost about $1,000. $1,000 is expected by the end of 2024. As of today, it's true that paying $1,500 for a 5080 3 months later is expensive for the percentage of performance increase. Nevertheless, I still have good hope that from a stock perspective things will improve a little bit, since we hear that it should get a little better starting from March. The release, I would say, of new models like today's 5070 Ti, but also the 5070s as well as the 9070 and 9070 XT from AMD in a few weeks, should help improve things a little and bring prices down to somewhat more normal levels, at least we hope so. But it's true that the situation lately in terms of availability and prices of high-end graphics cards is still quite catastrophic, which obviously creates a lot of frustration, which is completely normal. It's actually quite sad, because the arrival of new generation graphics cards is normally one of the most interesting aspects, I would say, in PC hardware, and we really want everything to go well, and for the new cards to bring a performance boost as well as some nice new features, allowing us to have a better graphics case for less money than before. But here it's true that the prevailing negative atmosphere isn't very pleasant. It's supposed to be leisure equipment for relaxing and having fun, not for getting stressed out. I really hope things will improve quickly. This brings us to the RTX 5070 Ti, and as I mentioned in the introduction, it's the card that intrigues me the most on paper, because in terms of the overall package, we find a card based on the same chip as the RTX 5080, the GB203, but restricted in several ways. This allows the use of chips that don't qualify for the 5080 to create a cheaper range, and the question, as always with this type of card, is whether the restriction will be severe or not. And in the previous generation, the 4070 Ti Super seemed quite appealing, at first glance, as it was thought to be almost a 4080 for a lower price, and we ended up with essentially an overclocked 4070 Ti with 16 GB of VRAM instead of 12, and I found its positioning quite complicated between the 4070 Super and the 4080 Super. So, if we compare the 5080 and this 5070 Ti, we have the same GB203 chip, Blackwell architecture, 10752 CUDA cores for the 5080 versus 8960 for the 5070 Ti, which is a 16% reduction in computing units, with slightly lower frequencies as well, even though, well, the announced frequencies on paper are often very different from what we find in practice. So I'll give you the average frequencies I observed on both cards directly, with 2780 MHz for the 5070 Ti versus 27117 MHz for the 5080, where the official specs give higher boost frequencies for the 5080, showing that the frequencies on paper don't mean much. 336 tensor cores for the 5080, 280 for the 5070 Ti, 84 RT cores for the 5080 compared to 70 for the 5070 Ti, which also aligns with the approximately 16% reduction in the cores themselves. For the memory subsystem, we have a 256-bit bus for both cards with 16 GB of GDDR7, but the 5080 has faster RAM at 30 Gbps, compared to 28 for the 5070 Ti, which means the bandwidth goes from 960 to 896 Gbps for the 5070 Ti, which is only a small 7% less, which isn't much. The level 2 cache, on the other hand, is reduced by 23%, going from 64 to 49 PS. In terms of power consumption, the TGP drops from 360 UW for the 5080 to 300W for the 5070 Ti. This represents a 16% reduction. The same pattern is observed with the 80 to 70 STI, showing a 16% decrease, less power consumption. Another cut to highlight is at the level of encoders-decoders, where the 5080 has 2 encoders and 2 decoders. For the 5070 Ti, we have 2 encoders and only 1 decoder of the latest generation nonetheless, which still offers better image quality in H.265 and Heavy 1 than on the older RTX, as well as support for 4.2.2 chroma sampling. For video creators, this can be important. As for the more detailed architecture, I won't go over it again here. I discussed it more in my review of the 5090. And if you want to find that in written format, or let's say web page, there's also Eric's excellent article on the Hardware & Co website, which I invite you to read at your leisure if the topic interests you. So in terms of specs, it's quite interesting because the 5080 was roughly a 4080 with 15% more performance, 80 to 15% more performance, and here it's the performance increase, and here it's Christie 80 with 15% more performance, and here it's the performance increase, and here it's... And the 5070 Ti on paper is roughly a 5080 with 15% less performance, so logically, we should end up very close to the 4080. Is that the case? To observe this, today we are going to test the 5070 Ti Ventus 3X OC from MSI, which is an MSRP model, which should normally be offered at the recommended price of $750 or $884 for us after conversion and adding VAT, $884 for us after conversion and adding VAT. Note that there is no Founders Edition model for the 5070 Ti. The MSI card, physically speaking, looks quite similar to the 4710 Ti Super Ventus from the same brand that we tested last year, which left a rather good impression on me at the time, especially regarding its cooling system, which was quite silent for the targeted range. And let's just say it right away, it's not at all the same for this 5070 Ti, because in terms of noise generated, this model is really quite disappointing. It's simply the loudest card in the lineup, apart from the 1080 Ti Founders Edition, because under load, the card tries to maintain 65 degrees on the core, and we're around 75 degrees for the VRAM, and the fans will ramp up to 2000 RPM to cool everything down, and as a result, it blows very hard. It's not a type of noise similar to the blower of the 1080 Ti, which sounds a bit more like a hairdryer than the Ventus here, but, well, it's too noisy for me for the MSI card. So I don't really know what's wrong, but the fan curve seems way too aggressive for my taste. I would have preferred that the card allow itself to heat up a bit more, around 75 degrees Celsius for the core and 80 degrees Celsius for the memory, since by locking the fans at 40%, that's more or less what we get, and it resulted in about 43 dBA, which is still audible, but much more acceptable in terms of noise because, well, sure, it's an MSRP card, but we're still talking about cards over 800 euros. We expect better performance at this price level. To still manage a range between a very quiet card, an audible card, and a very noisy card like today's card. So if you still buy this card at the time of release, it's either because noise is not a major criterion for you, or you're just going to deal with it. Afterwards, you can also create a custom fan curve to make it a little quieter, because, well, aside from this noise issue, it's a 5070 Ti like any other. In terms of performance, it changes absolutely nothing. Physically speaking, there's not much to criticize, it's quite understated, no RGB, it's a rather classic graphics card look. 2 visible cables on the edge, a bit unfortunate. The backplate is metal, true flow design, and here too the label is visible. We would prefer it on the edge below the card as other brands do. The inscriptions with the MSI RTX Dragon logo, while they don't really stand out, they're not particularly pretty either, but well, no problem here. As for the size, it's 30.3 cm in length, 12.1 cm in width, and it's 2.5 slots thick. And in terms of weight, it's about 1.1 kilo. Not the most compact card, but it will fit in most cases. For the power connector, we find the 12V2X6 connector. While for high-end graphics cases, we know it can be a source of problems as we've heard lately, for cards with 300W and less, I think there are far fewer potential issues. We haven't heard many problems with this connector for the 4080 or the 4710 Ti or T Super, which have similar power consumption to this, 5070 Ti with its TGP of 300W, which is between that of the 4710 Ti Super and the 4080. As for video outputs, it's the classic 3 DisplayPort 2.1B and 1 HDMI 2.1B. Regarding the bundle provided with the card, there's a small support for the graphics frame, lipstick type, which is what I generally prefer, so it's nice that it's included here. We also obviously have the adapter for the power connector with 2 branches here for 2x8 pins. So now that the introductions are done, let's see what this 5070 Ti has under the hood. As usual, we'll first take a look at the scaling for DLSS4 and multi-frame generation to see if it behaves differently from higher-end cards. The testing protocol here then, this is the same as for the 5080 and your 5090. We're still using 16 games in 1080p, but also 1440p, 3440x1440, and 4K for rasterization. We also have tests in AoE tracing and path tracing, but these are performed with upscaling in quality mode at 1440p and 4K only. We won't go through all the performance slides, but they are all available in an additional video linked at the top of the video description, and the slides are also available as files for supporters on the Ko-fi page for those interested. In short, let's see what it looks like. So, for the tests on the performance impact of DLSS4, upscaling, frame generation, and multi-frame generation, I gradually adjust the level of upscaling to be in what I would call realistic situations for the card I'm testing. With the 5090 we were on DLSS quality for all tests. With the 5080 it was a mix depending on the games, and for the 5070 Ti I set everything to DLSS performance, since with the new transformer model it no longer has much to envy from the old DLSS quality, making things much more playable, even in very challenging conditions. For example, Armor on Alan Wake 2 with path tracing, we see that natively we are below an average of 30 FPS, very high latency, not really playable. We see that by enabling upscaling, however, we reach an average of 60 FPS, which is generally the minimum we aim for to then activate frame generation. And we see that just like with the 5080, the new DLSS model is heavier than the old one, since we go from an average of 65 to 61 FPS. And for frame generation here in X2, we are also below the old frame generation. As we have already seen, it will depend a little on the games and the cards as well, even if the new frame gen algorithm is supposed to be lighter than the old one. So obviously the X3 and X4 modes allow for achieving higher fluidity, and the increase in latency for each level is less severe than the transition from non-frame gen to active frame gen. It's similar to our previous experience with the 5080 on this game. For Cyberpunk 2077 we are also using tracing there too, so in natively we start from very, very far. It's extremely demanding with an average of 8 FPS for the 5070 Ti here, and simply immense latency. Well, it's obviously unplayable. By enabling upscaling, as often the new model is a little more demanding than the old one. However, in terms of frame generation, the new model is lighter on this game than the old one, which prevents the latency from skyrocketing and allows it to reach slightly below an average of 90 FPS with frame gen X2 and the X3 and X4 modes, allowing you to reach the limits of 120 or 144 Hz screen. Personally, I conduct my tests on a 4K, 160 Hz monitor, and I prefer to play with frame generation and multi-frame generation enabled in the scenario we see here, rather than not activating it. For me, in this scenario, it's completely playable. The latency is not terrible, and visually it's more pleasant than with just upscaling here. But obviously, not everyone will agree, since I would say we're really at the limit of usability here for 4K upscaled with frame generation on this game with such demanding settings. However, in 1440p it would run smoothly just with upscaling. It's always good, I would say, to have the option of frame generation or multi-frame generation for this kind of scenario if you appreciate the final rendering. For Dragon Age the Vanguard, it's a much lighter game than the previous two. Natively with tracing, we're already at an average of 51 FPS, and just with upscaling we reach over 80 FPS on average, which is more than playable, and we find the new heavier model in terms of upscaling than the old one, and the new frame generation is lighter than the old version, and we see that the latency even with frame gen is around 135 millis. In this type of game it works very, very well, and as we have already seen in other scenarios, the latency of frame gen X3 is similar to the old frame gen X2. And finally, for Marvel Rivals, where I conduct the test, I would say more to observe the behavior of all the tech caches, because it's really the type of game where you aim to have the lowest possible latency, so FG is not recommended for this game, and we see that upscaling already allows for achieving very good performance and the lowest latency since we are under 20 minutes. And with FG X2, the new algorithm is lighter than the old one, and we see that the latency in X3 mode is similarly comparable to the old X2 mode, just like on Dragon Nest 2 earlier. So overall, I would say that the behavior of the different technologies is very similar to what we observed on the 5080, which is quite a good thing here. It will be interesting to see how it will perform on the 5070 and lower models with their smaller chips, as it's true that in the previous generation, this is where it started to get a bit more complicated, for example, for frame generation, since it was quite demanding. We continue with some application tests, starting with Blender Open Data. Here, it's not great since we are under 10% gains compared to the 4070 Ti Super, and we see that the 4080 Super leads by more than 10%, so we are roughly in between, and the 5080 is almost 20% more performant. So it's true that on Blender the cuts on the GPU are still quite impactful. For the Procyon flow test, however, for artificial intelligence image generation, we see that in FP8 the 5070 Ti performs slightly better than the 4080 Super, but we can say it's roughly a tie. However, in FP4, the strong point of the Blackwell architecture, the 5070 Ti pulls ahead to achieve almost double the performance even compared to the 4090. So here, it's not bad at all, even if it's a particular scenario. Let's move on to gaming. Now, I'm not going to go over all 16 games in detail, but we'll do, I would say, a mix of several games in 1440p, 4K, and a bit of ray tracing as well. A little legally packed powder, And we start with Alan Wake 2 in 1440p, where the 5070 is really very close to the 4080 Super, with less than a 3% difference for 3 FPS. Well, it's roughly the same performance as the non-Super 4080 here, and compared to the 5080, we see a 20% difference, which is one of the largest gaps we'll have the opportunity to see in rasterization. And in 4K, we again find the 5070Ti just barely behind the 4080 Super by 2 FPS, and thus also very close to the 7900 XTX, with the 5080 being 15% above. On the other hand, it's true that compared to cards like the 2080 Ti, which I would say is at a performance level similar to the RTX 3070, we are still looking at a 2x increase in performance, and in 4K ray tracing low, which is, as a reminder, the mode without path tracing in the game, and with DLSS in quality mode, we find the 5070 Ti on par with the 4080 and the 7900 XTX, which also perform very well in this scenario. However, in high ray tracing, meaning path tracing, the 5070 Ti falls slightly below the 4080 Super Timor, while the XTX completely drops, and the 5080, I would say, leads by almost 30% compared to the 70 Ti. We continue with Black Mid Wukong in 1440p, and here again, the 5070 Ti is neck and neck with the 4080 Super, with only about a 10% difference from the 5080, so not bad at all for the newcomer. No major changes in 4K, the 5070 Ti maintains a slight lead over the 4080 Super. And the XTX is at the same performance level. The 5080 is almost 10% ahead, which is only 5 FPS on average. Clearly, we're playing under very similar conditions here. You'll need to use scaling for both cards to achieve more than 60 FPS on average. And when ray tracing is activated on the title, the 5070 Ti holds its ground with the 4080 Super, and we're 17% behind the 5080. Well, we're at around 30 FPS on average for these cards anyway. It's not particularly playable here, since only the 5090 reaches an average of 60. For Call of Duty Black Ops 6 in 1440p, it's still a game where AMD cards have an advantage. Here the 5070 Ti is neck and neck with the 7900 XT, and the 4080 Super is really just behind. A 5% difference with the 5080 here, which is to say almost nothing. In 4K, average 144 FPS matching 4080 Super, 7900 XT, XTX 5080, 10% higher. In Cyberpunk 2077, 1440p, 5070 Ti slightly below 4080 Super, same as 7900 XTX. 2077 in 1440p, and we find the 5070T just a notch below the 4080 Super here, and at the same level as the 7900 CX, so it's really much the same. The 5070, the 5080 is only 10% above, and compared to cards like the 6700 XT or 2080 Ti, we are still looking at a 1 amongst 2 here. In 4K, the 5070T, the 4080 Super, and the 7200 XTX are practically tied, and the 5080 is 17% above here. In Ultra Ray Tracing, however, we find the 4080 Super above the 5070 Ti, with a slightly larger gap than in raster, even if it remains quite close, with almost an 8% difference for only 4 FPS. Well, in any case here, you'll need to lower the details a bit or slightly increase the level of upscaling. The Radeons are obviously also struggling a bit more. We find a 13% difference with the 5080, which is still not too bad. And if we further increase the load with path tracing, then it remains complicated. The 5070 stage just barely reaches an average of 30 FPS. You'll need to switch to DLSS performance to get better results. The 4080 Super is at 34 FPS, the 5080 at 36, which is a 16% difference on paper. It's true that in terms of raw FPS, let's say, it's obviously much less impressive, and it doesn't really change the gaming experience significantly here either. We move on to Final Fantasy XV in 1440p. The 5070 Ti is not at its best here, but it wasn't the game where the other RTX 5000s particularly shined either. A 12% difference on average, and 8 on the 1% for the 4080 Super, which was already not far behind the 5080, so it's quite logical to find the 5070 Ti a little bit below. And in 4K, no major changes in the ranking, but the differences are a little less significant. The 5070 Ti here ends up with a 5% difference from the 4080 Super and 15% compared to the 5080 Super, and 15% compared to the 5080. For Flight Simulator 2024 and 1440p, we find a tie with the 4080 Super, a 10% difference with the 5080 and 13% with the 16900 XTX, which is quite comfortable here. We still see a good Doors X2. At 4K, the 5070 Ti matches the 4080 Super. Each 5080 is 8% higher, 5 FPS difference, 11 FPS XTX. On par with the 4080, the 1080 is only 8% higher for an average difference of 5 FPS and 11 FPS for the RTX. We move on to Ghost of Tsushima in 1440p. Well, it's another game that generally favors AMD cards, and we find the 5070 Ti at the same level as the 7900 XT and the 4080 Super, with almost a 14% difference in favor of the 5080 and 19% for the 7900 XTX. And in 4K, no upheaval, I would say. The differences between the cards are similar, not much else to say here. For God of War Ragnarok in 1440p, we find the lineup of 5070 Ti, 4080 Super, and 7900 XTI running in almost the same zones. And the 5080 ends up with an 11% difference, and in 4K. It's almost the same, except for the slightly weaker 1% lows for the 5070 Ti. For Marvel Rivals, it's slightly more in favor of Nvidia cards. The 5070 STX thus ends up just ahead of the 7900 XTX, and the 4080 Super is a small step above that. But overall, it's the same experience for the three cards, and we find a 14% advantage for the 5080 here. In 4K, however, the 5070 Ti is now on par with the 4080 Super, the XTX is just slightly below, the 5080 is now less than 10% ahead, and as often, we see a 1:2 comparison with the venerable 2080 Ti, and we finish with its Lentil 2 in 1440p. We still find the 5070 Ti at a similar performance level to the 4080 Super and 7900 XTX in raster, and the 5080 with less than a 10% difference. And in 4K, Nvidia's cards gain a slight advantage over the XTX bouquet, with the 5070 standing out. Even against the 4080 Super, the 5080 pulls ahead a bit more with a 14% difference now. And in ray tracing, well, we see that the 4080 Super and the 5070 are neck and neck. And even if the 5080 is above by 7%, well, it's not really a huge difference. So when we get to the average performance across the 16 games now, well, no surprise here. The 5070 reaches a performance level similar to the 7900 XTX and the 4080 Super Stelix and at the Academy 80 Super. Big Stelix and at the Academy 80 Super, which leads the 5070 Ti by 2.5%, so very clearly it's roughly the performance level of the original 4080 on average. And we see that in 1080p, the 5080 is only 8.75% above, so almost imperceptible in most scenarios, 8.75% above, so almost imperceptible in most scenarios, and almost scenarios imperceptible in most scenarios, and almost. And regarding the 4070 TNT Super, we're roughly 15% more for the 5070 Ti. So well, in 1080p, you can very well play with less powerful cards than this 5070 Ti, of course. You don't necessarily have to go for very expensive cards to play in 1080p, and in 1440p, now here again, we are really very close to the 4080 Super with a 2.4% difference. It's the original 4080, it's the same gaming experience overall for the trio 7900 XTX, 4080 Super, 4080, and 5070 Ti. As we have seen in most games, there is a 12% difference with the 5080, and Cinco on proprietary output, as we have seen in most games, we find a 12% difference with the 5080. And Apple 5070? Given the price difference between the two cards, it's true that it's still difficult to justify the extra cost for an average difference of 15 FPS. In most situations, we will have an almost identical gaming experience, and we are about 17% better than the 4070 Ti and Ti Super. Obviously, there's no reason to switch to the newcomer for 1440p here. As with most of the RTX 5000 series, if you're already on a relatively high-end RTX or RX from the previous generation, it won't bring you much more here. But if we consider slightly older or less powerful cards like the 6700 XT or 2080 Ti, which are roughly equivalent to a 3070, we are looking at roughly double the performance and over 200% compared to the 1080 Ti. For light ray tracing, let's say, not the path tracing mode, as we have seen in various games, the 4080 Super often comes out just a bit ahead of the 5070 Ti, but on average it remains very close with less than a 3% difference. And the 5080 ends up 13% ahead here. The Radeons are obviously struggling much more, but with less demanding ray tracing, they still manage not too badly. If we activate path tracing, then the 4080 Super shows a slightly larger gap compared to the 5070 Ti than in other scenarios, but the difference remains under 5%, so it's still very close. The 5080 shows a 12% difference here, which is also not a huge gap. For 3440 x 1.40, we still have the trio of 4080 Super, 5070 Ti, and 7900 TIX, no surprises here. A 12% difference in favor of the 5080, it's gradually increasing, just like the gap with the 4070 Ti and Ti Super, which are now approaching 20%, and we still see a good 2x compared to the 2080 Ti, and 55% on cards like the RTX 3080, 55% on cards like the RTX 3080. In 4K raster now, this is often where the gaps widen a little more, but we still find our trio, I would say 7960 Ti, 4080 Super, and 5070 Ti almost tied, and the 5080 still leads by about 13.5%. The gap compared to the 4070 Ti and T Super now is around 23%, so here we see a generational gain more significant than between the 4080 and the 5080. It's not the generational gain of the century, but if we consider that the recommended price is down by 6%, it's not that bad, and we still find a good X2 compared to cards like the 2080 Ti, 3070 or 4060 Ti, and 60% better compared to the 3080 or 4070, which is still not nothing, and 60% better compared to the 3080 or 4070, which is still quite significant. 60%. In ray tracing now, we are still slightly behind the 4080 Super, and there's a slightly more pronounced gap with the 5080 here with a 17% difference. However, we still find almost a 2x /1 improvement compared to the 3080, which encounters some RAM issues in the most demanding games. In path tracing, we remain slightly behind the 4080 Super, but it's quite minimal. However, it's still interesting to see that the gap with the SAMI 80 narrows compared to lighter ray tracing, as we fall back to an 11% difference. So where we expected a larger gap with the most demanding ray tracing, that's not the case. 37 versus 41 FPS on average, it really doesn't make much difference in usage. Now let's move on to energy efficiency. So quite logically, the 5070 Ti consumes less than the 5080 as we're dealing with a card with a 300W TGP compared to 360 for its bigger sister. Despite everything, in 1440p, the gap between the two cards is quite small, as we go from an average consumption of 286W for the 5080 to 263Ws for the 5070T, and it also consumes slightly less than the 4080 Super, but well, in terms of energy efficiency, clearly the RTX 40 and 50 are in the same ballpark, and in 4K now the average consumption slightly increases to 285W for the 5070 Ti compared to 316W for the 5080. The 4080 Super was around 297W with its TGP of 320, so the results are quite logical here. And since the performance gap isn't huge between the two cards, the 5070 does slightly better than the 4080 Super in terms of energy efficiency in the end. Let's move on to overclocking and undervolting then. Since we had heard some pretty nice things about the 5080 in terms of overclocking, I tried to push the 5070 Ti a little more than the small overclock I usually do. And indeed, it's possible to gain performance here as well, despite the fact that the Ventus used for the test doesn't allow increasing the power limit, and I was still able to add 450 MHz or chunk to the core and push the RAM to over 2000 on Afterburner, which allowed for almost 9% more performance in 1440p. This should allow the 5070 Ti to often reach a performance level similar to that of the 5080 at stock without the console taking off, even if it consumes almost 20 WW more than at stock. Of course, the 5080 can also be overclocked quite well apparently, but still it's a nice potential performance gain, a little higher than what we could get on the RTX 4000 in general. As always, I remind you that overclocking is not an exact science. You might get a chip that will accept a nice overclocking margin, or you might end up with a card that won't budge at all. So always see it, I would say, as a little bonus on top of the base performance that suits you, rather than counting on it by thinking, well, I'll almost always have performance equivalent to the 5080 or nearly so. Unfortunately, that's not how it works. Another option that might be interesting is to lower the power limit to 83. Which is the lower limit, while still doing a slightly more moderate overclock, which brings us here to 6% more performance for the same consumption as stock, which is quite good. And it's interesting to see that even just reducing to 83% of the power limit, we lose almost nothing in terms of performance, while consuming slightly less. So well, there is potential to gain a few more percent in performance or save a few watts for those who want to fine-tune their equipment a bit more, and I will see if it's possible to conduct tests on a wider range of games from an overclocking perspective to see how it goes. So, in the end, this 5070 T-Ben, I must admit that I was quite pleasantly surprised overall, because even though I expected a card close to the 4080, I didn't expect it to be at the same level as the 4080. Not super, let's say, personally, I expected it more, 5-10% edge below. Depending on the games, let's say with a good 20% difference from the 5080, because, well, that seemed to be the type of gap aimed for is often what we find between the different cards at NVIDIA. But well, as we saw in the tests on average, here we have a 12% difference in 1440p and 13.5% in 4K compared to the 5080. So it's not a huge gap. For a card 107, still 25% cheaper, which is a difference of about 300 euro at the official price. It's still not insignificant, and it makes the additional performance percentage quite expensive. And clearly, I find that the 5070 is a much more relevant proposition in terms of the report performance price. And I think it makes the 5080 almost obsolete, since there aren't many scenarios where I would pay the price difference for a 5080 rather than the 5070 Ti, unless you absolutely want that small performance gain, regardless of the cost. So, well, the theoretical price-performance ratio is quite okay, I think, but the problem is more about availability. And the prices in stores precisely, since we can well imagine that during the launch period it will be very difficult to find a 5070 Ti at $885, even though, as with every launch, there will be a small stock that must be sold at the recommended price by Nvidia, which will as often be snapped up in a few minutes. And outside of this, I would say a small quantity of cards there, no big doubt that the bulk of the launch stock will easily end up at $1,000 or even more, which in the end would bring us back to prices similar to the 480 Super from the end of 2024. So, some people settle for it too much for lack of a better option, and also out of weariness or the impossibility of waiting, which I can understand. But while I would never recommend buying a card much more expensive than its official price unless absolutely forced to, personally I wouldn't do it. But then everyone does their best according to their situation. Otherwise, why is the current situation really so bad in terms of supply? So the problem is that since there is nothing really available in terms of cards, Nvidia on the other range, and also no more cards from the previous generation for quite some time now, there is a lot of anticipation to buy a high-end graphics card, and there is very little stock, either due to production or delivery issues. It's quite unclear, but I would say that for the moment the supply is very, very, very tight, regardless of the reason. As a result, the different market players are taking advantage of this to raise prices, and everyone is making a little money by taking advantage of the situation. Also, whether it's the brands themselves, the wholesalers, the distributors, the resellers, since the demand is much higher than the supply at the moment, and the little stock there is will be snapped up anyway, in a few minutes, why hold back? The entire chain is to blame, including Nvidia, for the lack of stock at the launches. Whether the reason is technical or otherwise, it's the customers who suffer, and that's not normal. And it's very unfortunate because at the normal price, the offer is appealing, even if it seems revolutionary, let's be clear, but it's the best offer in the 5000 series so far, since in terms of generational gap, we're looking at a 20% improvement, roughly speaking, compared to the 4610 Ti and the 4610 Ti Super in 4K. It's not the generational gain of the century, but since the official price was reduced by $50 and the card has no particular weaknesses, in terms of RAM or power consumption, for example, if we weigh everything 20% more performance and 6% less in price, we are looking at a performance improvement, a price improvement of about 25%, let's say. That's already much more positive than the performance. The almost linear price of the 5090 compared to the 4090, or the small 15% more of the 5080. I think everyone would have preferred a 25% positive evolution in price performance also for the 5080 and 90, and the reception of the cards would have been more positive as well, since if we keep in mind that we are on the same manufacturing process for both generations, which limits the room for improvement in terms of performance, it wouldn't have made the most impressive generation ever, but well, it would have already been a bit nicer than what we've had so far. In the very high-end segment, as I've already mentioned, there is really no competition for these two cards. No reason to position them more aggressively. Nvidia has free rein to charge for the performance. Moreover, at a premium price where the 5070 Ti and the 5070 will have competing cards against them, hence a slightly more reasonable pricing. Strangely, competition sometimes has its benefits. The good news, I would say, is that the 5070 Ti lowers the official price of cards at the 4080 level by another notch at Nvidia. It had already dropped a notch last year with the 4080 Super, and even if the price will surely be abnormally high at launch, well, I have little doubt that it will fall closer to the MSRP within a few weeks. Once the initial rush is over, more cards are available on the market across all ranges, and also once AMD releases its new products. We hear that more stock will be available starting in March, and I hope that's the case, because right now the situation is quite catastrophic. There's almost nothing in stock in most stores, at a normal price, let's say. Take a look on Amazon or any store, Drupal, DLC and the like. There's really not much for anything 4070 and above. Otherwise, speaking of AMD, we clearly understand the pebble in the shoe for RDNA. It's this 5070 Ti precisely, because from everything we've heard in terms of rumors, the 9070 XT should be quite close in performance to this one. Will it be almost identical, a notch above or a notch below? We don't know yet, but to gain market share, the card will still need to be offered for less than $750, because even if one can argue that the official price is currently fictitious for the RTX in the market, this announced price remains fixed nonetheless. It's there, you know. And to make an impression, AMD will have to take it into consideration, because if they announce the 9100 DXD at $700, for example, at least it clearly won't make most users switch sides, because where AMD played on the board with slightly higher raster performance and more VRAM for 10 to 20% less in price on the previous generation, A strategy that, by the way, was not successful since Radeon has never been so low in market share, which doesn't take away from the performance of the cards themselves, I would say. It's just that it wasn't sufficiently appealing to the target audience. But here, the matchup 910 XT against 5070 XTI will probably be even more complicated, because if the performances are almost identical in raster and slightly lower in RT for AMD, we have 16GB of VRAM for both cards, we lose all the GeForce features, and a $50 difference, it seems clearly insufficient to me. $100 or 13% less might slightly satisfy the brand's fans, but I don't think it would allow gaining market share with a broader audience. As I've been saying for a while, to make an impression, ideally, they should aim for $600, which would be a 20% price reduction. That starts to become a bit more tempting, especially if there's plenty of availability at launch. And still nothing in terms of stock on the GeForce side. But even with 20%, I'm not sure it's enough to gain market share in the long term. And the masterstroke, I would say, would be $550 for the 910 XT, which is the same price as the future 5070. This was, by the way, the same price as the 7900 GRE, just to remind you, aligning with the price of the 5070 while offering similar performance to the 5070 Toy-Con, that would immediately be much more appealing. Some might think that saying AMD needs to be 20-25% cheaper than Nvidia for equivalent performance is a bit exaggerated. But we already saw in the previous generation that in any case AMD doesn't sell enough. And it's AMD itself that suggests this by stating they want to change their strategy to gain market share. This means that the previous strategy wasn't working, because besides the hardware itself, whether we like Nvidia or not, the software offering is more comprehensive than AMD's. And this also impacts the pricing, the overall value of the product. On the 5110 Ti, we still have DLSS4, which works on all RTX cards, I remind you, at the level of the upscaler. And DLSS4 is already present in more games than FSR4 will be at its release. And we know that the new transformer model for DLSS4 upscaling is a big quality step up for Nvidia. Whereas with FSR4, we hope it already catches up with the old version of DLSS in terms of image quality, which would be a very nice upgrade compared to FSR3. The reconstruction still has no equivalent at AMD or Intel, even though we suspect that both are surely working on something similar. AMD had shown some things on this subject. Reflex 2, which should allow further gains in latency for competitive games, and perhaps eventually improve things for frame chain latency as well. There is Canvidia working on this type of technology too. For now, the technologies and applications of the RTX broadcast suite for streamers or content creators, the RTX HDR, for those who have a screen that supports it, performance in applications like Blender or for artificial intelligence, still well above competitors, still the best video encoder for streaming, currently the dual encoder, and quite a lot of stuff nonetheless. Frame generation and multi-frame generation. So, as I mentioned in the 5080 review, I have no problem with the technology itself. It has its place. It works quite well. In some games I use it. It allows you to reach your monitor's refresh rate more easily. And if you have a 240Hz plus monitor, multi-frame gen can be nice. And it's true that in single-player games, the added tension is rarely very disturbing if the base frame rate is good enough, especially when playing with a controller. For Alan Wake 2 or Cyberpunk, with path tracing for example, it allows the 5.1.10, you're going to get a pretty nice level of fluidity in 4K DLSS4 performance plus multi-frame gen, while still being completely playable for me, for example. Afterwards, maybe for you, it isn't. And in 1440p on the other hand, we are clearly much more flexible. However, for competitive games, frame generation is useless. Let's say because it increases latency, which is counterproductive for this type of game. So the multi-frame gen, it's a graphical compromise that one may or may not appreciate. But outside of poorly optimized games, frame gen is just another graphical option. We either activate it or we don't, that we like it or we don't. There's no problem. The issue, I would say, is more with Nvidia's marketing, which presents the technology as a normal performance boost, which frame generation is not. As I mentioned in the 5080 review, imagine if Intel or AMD introduced FrameGen X10 or X20 and made nice graphs, showing that with it, they outperform a 5090. It wouldn't mean anything either, because the result on the screen is no longer the same, so we're no longer comparing the same thing. So saying that the 5070 will offer a similar level of performance to the 4090 thanks to multi-frame gen captures the idea, but it's not the reality since we're not comparing the same thing. And it's very, very poorly presented, and I still think it was a very bad idea from a marketing standpoint, which had a more negative than positive impact on the technology's image. It's a shame because the technology itself is good to have. It's an additional option. I have no problem with it. And obviously the other unknown is all the new features that Nvidia has announced in terms of neural rendering. There are a bunch of potentially interesting technologies, and these are also compatible with all generations of RTX. We are mainly waiting to see the impact on performance between the different generations, and maybe when these technologies are more prevalent and more implemented in games, At that point, perhaps the RTX 5000 will have a clearer advantage over previous generations in terms of performance, but the problem is that we don't have any games using them so far. And for these technologies to become widespread, it will surely take several years. It's cool to see Nvidia offering new features in rendering techniques and all that, and that they are usable by their current hardware. But the question, as often happens when we have such new features, is where will we be once they are really used in games? That we don't know. But it's true that lately, Nvidia is somewhat the only one pushing new technologies and approaches, which is a shame. I would really love to see AMD or Intel also offering new and unique rendering innovations. Otherwise, who is the 570Ti intended for? Well, obviously, if you already have a card like 7900 XT or 4710 Ti or higher, no interest in most scenarios. On the other hand, it's true that to replace a card like the 3070 6700 XT or 2080 Ti, well, it's a nice upgrade with roughly a 2x increase in performance. And I would even say with a card like the 3080, 4070 or even 6800 XT, 7800 XT, I could understand, depending on the scenarios, with roughly 50% more performance. And depending on the card you have, it also means more VRM, so the upgrade can be justified, at least if the price isn't too high. It remains a card that will be around 900 € and more for some time. It is still a card that requires a fairly substantial budget, but it's the best offer in this new generation for now. Aside from excessive prices in stores, of course, and despite everything, should you jump on it right away? Personally, I would wait to see what AMD will offer against this card, because if the Nvidia ecosystem doesn't interest you, depending on the prices offered, RDNA 4 could be an interesting option for less money, especially if their stock and prices don't skyrocket like they did for the RTX 5000. And it's never a bad thing to have all the cards in hand to make your choice, and we'll know more in about a week, so it's not much longer to wait. However, if you absolutely want a GeForce with this level of performance and you have the budget, we probably won't see anything better for quite some time. And if you find a nice MSRP model on the release day at its base price, there's nothing better at the moment. So there you have it. I think we've covered everything for today. For this 5070 Ti, a card that is potentially quite nice, but at its normal price. So I hope you enjoyed this review, and I'm quite curious to see where the 5070 and AMD cards will stand as well. We'll know more about that in a few weeks. Otherwise, as usual, if you enjoyed the video, the annoying YouTube stuff, it's silly, but it helps. The channel's Amazon page, if you want examples of type conflicts, the current graphics cards. Even though right now, there are no graphics cards. I hope that will change. It's in the video description. And as always, a huge thank you to the support member and YouTube of the channel who helped with its survival. And we really need it. We'll see each other very soon for more videos. Sending you kisses. See you next time.